This is no longer a partisan thing to say this, but it is a genuine disgrace, a repulsive maneuver that Donald Trump continues to shamefully employ in every single one of his political campaigns. That is, dragging our nation's veterans and their families into the muck with him to be used as political props. After days of trying to deflect and redirect outrage associated with his performative trip to Arlington National Cemetery, during which he posed with Gold Star families in an area where photos are traditionally prohibited, the Trump campaign now insists President Biden and Vice President Harris are the ones who ignored invitations to attend. Just one problem. The White House insists no such invitation exists or was ever extended. The Vice President this weekend accused Donald Trump of, quote, disrespecting sacred ground, all for the sake of a political stunt. She goes on, quote, if there is one thing on which we as Americans can all agree, it is that our veterans, our military families, and service members should be honored, never disparaged, and treated with nothing less than our highest respect and gratitude. But this is Mr. Suckers and Losers we're talking about here. His words, not ours, whose personal history is painted wall to wall with not just moments, but true beliefs that dishonor the military. Consider how Fred Trump, the disgraced ex-president's nephew, described the way his uncle dodged the draft in his book out earlier this summer. Quote, I have an idea, Fred Trump Sr. said. The move involved a podiatrist who rented space on the ground floor of a Fred Trump building. After a call from my grandfather, Dr. Larry Bronstein wrote a letter saying Donald Trump suffered from bone spurs, an ailment so severe that this otherwise healthy 24-year-old male could not possibly serve in the United States military. Bone spurs? No one in the family had ever heard of Donald's bone spurs. No one had ever seen him hobbling. No one had ever heard him complain. About other things, sure, but not about bone spurs. Joining us at the table, nephew of Donald Trump and author of All in the Family, The Trumps and How We Got This Way. Fred Trump is here, and he's still with us. I was off last week, but this story, of course, guts me. Every time, and I'm mad at myself for still being able to feel pain at things that Trump does, that your uncle does. But I was pained reading about Arlington. And the first thing I emailed and said to my team is I want to talk to Fred Trump when he's back, because we, at the very end of our conversation about your book, right, you brought me into this room that you remember being in. Just tell me the story about his commitment. He worked hard to not serve.
Yeah, both he and thank you very much for having me back, and a pleasure to meet you, Professor. This all happened in what my grandparents called the library, which is funny because the only books in there were the yellow pages and the white pages. Many of your audience doesn't know what those are. But it was a very serious thing. And yeah, I was young, but I certainly remember the atmosphere around. Donald had a deferment at Fordham. Then when my father helped him get into UPenn, where my daughter Andrea graduated from, she's out here right now, he had two more. And when he graduated, as I try to eloquently say, is get ready to pack your bags, pal, because you're heading overseas. And that's when the reality really set in. So my grandfather, who was a very powerful guy in the Democratic machine in Brooklyn and Queens, came up with this, the only word you can use is scheme. And this podiatrist bought into it, and Donald went from 1A, which is front of the line, to 1Y, I believe it was, which was you're safe for now. Then, of course, in the end of 1969, when the Nixon administration was getting a lot of flack for just having minorities basically serving in the military, the numbers were coming up, and Donald was very lucky to have a high number, 360 something. In fact, his younger brother, my younger uncle Robert, had his number called before, but he was going to Boston University. As I mentioned in the book, two things really troubled me about it. Several years after this episode, when it was clear that he was not going to be serving, I went to a little prep school in Queens, where Donald went also. He never made it to graduation. That's why he got sent to New York Military Academy. But I met this young woman who was selling POW MIA bumper stickers. And I didn't understand why. The reason why, her father was MIA. So even at a young age, I was probably 10 or 11 at the time, like, wait a second, her father, she may never see him again. Yet my uncle, through the moxie of my grandfather and Donald, did not serve. The other thing, who was that person that took his place to serve in Vietnam? And what became of that person? We'll never know. We won't know his name or anything like that.
But what is amazing to me about what you tell is that I remember when the Atlantic story broke, and I think they were the first to report that your uncle described the men and women who serve and die as suckers and losers. And then the further reporting about him standing at Arlington with General John Kelly and not understanding why his son would serve his country.
Yeah.
And then the reporting that came out down the road that General Milley at a ceremony had to defend the decision to have someone who was wounded serving the country as part of the ceremony because your uncle said, quote, no one wants to see that. Is that it's a continuum. It starts, he believes that they're suckers and losers when he's 24.
Right.
And that what he said 50 years later wasn't an anomaly. I'm sure it was a scoop journalistically, but it was who he always was. How else did that reveal itself to you?
Well, first, let me just say, my father, Donald's older brother, was in ROTC at Lehigh University and then voluntarily went into the Air National Guard. The only one in the Trump family to ever serve. In fact, I had the honor of using his trunk, his Army trunk, throughout my summer camp days. Everything about him, and we spoke the last time we were here about how I had the honor of meeting Senator McCain. You know, a word that has been cheapened over the years, but I said to my kids, Andrea, Christopher, who were there, and my wife, Lisa, this is a genuine hero, okay? Let's make no mistake about it. The fact that Donald called him, in essence, a loser, I don't get it. But anyone who is disabled or anyone who he deems lesser than him is a loser, okay, that's just the way he is. That ain't gonna change.
Why do you think people in the military support him?
I have no idea. And I know many people who were in the military, and I had the pleasure of speaking on an interview with National Defense Radio, which goes out to the armed services. And I told the truth. I basically told this story, and I said, he just doesn't give a shit about them. He just doesn't. It's the great Godfather 2, one of the last scenes when Sonny says, country ain't your blood, kid. And Michael Corleone says, no, I don't believe that. Donald believes in Donald.